My MIL booked a family cruise for everyone except me, so I showed up in the Caribbean on my family's mega yacht. Now she's begging for an invite. My mother-in-law Diane announced the family cruise at Sunday dinner. I've booked us all on a 7-day Caribbean cruise for Christmas. She pulled out printed tickets and started handing them out. One for my husband Brett, one for his sister Amy, one for Amy's husband, one for Brett's brother, one for his brother's girlfriend who'd been dating him for 3 months. Then she sat back down. I waited. What about mine? I asked. Diane looked confused. Oh, I figured you'd want to spend Christmas with your own family. You're always talking about them. I hadn't mentioned my family in months. Brett just sat there eating his potatoes. But I'm Brett's wife. We've been married for 4 years. Diane shrugged. Well, the rooms are already booked. It's 5 people, and the ship doesn't allow 6 to a suite. You understand. The girlfriend who'd been around for 3 months was going, but I wasn't. This wasn't new. Diane had been doing this for years. The family reunion in Vegas? Sorry, the hotel room blocks filled up. The weekend at their lake house? We assumed you were working. The wine tasting tour? It's really more of a blood family thing. But a cruise was different. A whole week watching my husband leave for a vacation I wasn't invited on. Brett tried to smooth it over in the car. Maybe we can book you a ticket separately. You could get a room on a different floor. I asked if he was seriously suggesting I book myself onto a cruise where his entire family already had rooms together. What else can we do? She already paid, he said. What he could do was obvious, but he wasn't going to do it. That's when I called my father. My family had money. Real money. The kind where we had boats with names and houses in multiple countries. I'd never flaunted it because I loved Brett for who he was, not what he had. But Diane had pushed too far. Dad, I said, I need to charter the Mariana for Christmas week. The big one. My father didn't even ask why. Done. Where to? I told him the Caribbean, specifically the same ports the cruise was going to. He laughed. Someone exclude you from something? He knew me too well. The next Sunday dinner, Diane was going on about the cruise again, showing photos of the ship, talking about the dining room, the activities. Such a shame you can't come, she said to me. But you'll have a nice, quiet Christmas here. I smiled. Actually, I won't be here. My family's doing something that week too. Diane barely looked up. That's nice. A little local get-together? I pulled out my phone and showed them the yacht. 180 feet of pure luxury. We're taking this to the Caribbean. Same ports as your cruise, actually. What a coincidence. Brett dropped his fork. Amy leaned in to look closer. Is that a yacht? Like a private yacht? I nodded. It's one of ours. We'll have a full crew, chef. Everything. My parents, my siblings, their kids. We're even bringing my cousin's new boyfriend. Family's family, you know. Diane's face went through several expressions. That must cost a fortune. I shrugged. Dad owns it. No cost, really. Just the fuel and crew. Brett suddenly got interested. Maybe I could skip the cruise and come with you instead? I laughed. Oh no, you already have plans. Besides, it's really more of a blood family thing. You understand. Diane tried to recover. Well, cruise ships have so many more activities. Casinos, shows, multiple restaurants. I kept scrolling through photos on my phone. True. We just have the jet skis, the submarine, the helicopter for island hopping. Pretty boring compared to a cruise ship. Amy's husband was staring. Did you say submarine? The best part was still coming. Oh, and since we'll be in the same ports, maybe we'll see each other. We could wave from the yacht while you're... What deck are you on again? Interior rooms? Diane's face was red. We have balcony rooms. I pretended to think. Right, those tiny balconies on the side. You'll be able to see us perfectly. The yacht usually has to anchor away from the cruise ships because we need more space. Brett was panic texting me under the table. Please let me come. Please. I didn't know you were doing this. I ignored him and kept talking. My brother's girlfriend is so excited. She's only been dating him for a month, but family's family, right, Diane? The week of the cruise came. My family and I boarded the Mariana 2 days before they left, making sure to post nothing online until we were already at sea. Then I started sharing photos. The breakfast was spread on the deck, the sunset from the hot tub. My mom and I are doing yoga on the helipad. Brett called me from their first port. We can see your yacht from the ship. It's enormous. He sounded miserable. Everyone keeps asking about it. The captain even announced it over the speaker. I was getting a massage on the deck at that moment. How fun! How's your cruise? I could hear Diane in the background asking if that was me. Brett said something muffled, then, Mom wants to know if she can come see the yacht. I told Brett to put his mom on speaker. Sure, Diane can come see the yacht. We'll be docked at Marina Bay tomorrow afternoon around 2. Just take a water taxi from the cruise port. Brett's voice got lighter, almost happy. Really? That's great. Thank you so much. I could hear Diane in the background saying something about how nice that was of me. I hung up and walked over to where my brother was doing tricks on the jet ski near the yacht. Guess who's coming to visit tomorrow? My brother cut the engine and floated closer. Please tell me it's your mother-in-law. I nodded and he started laughing so hard he almost fell off into the water. My dad was sitting on the upper deck reading, and he looked up when he heard the noise. "What's so funny?" My brother called up to him. "She invited Diane to come see the yacht." My dad put his book down and came to the railing. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I shrugged, but something in his tone made me stop and think. What did I actually want from letting Diane visit? Was I trying to rub her face in what she excluded me from? Did I want an apology? Did I just want her to see that I had my own family who actually wanted me around? I didn't have a clear answer, and that bothered me more than I expected. That evening, my mom found me sitting on the main deck watching the sunset. She sat down next to me without saying anything for a minute. Then she asked quietly what I really wanted from this whole situation. I admitted I didn't know. Part of me wanted Diane to apologize and understand what she'd done wrong. Part of me just wanted her to see exactly what she'd excluded me from and feel bad about it. Part of me wanted to prove I didn't need her family's approval because I had my own family who loved me. My mom listened and then said that those were all valid feelings, but I should figure out which one mattered most before Diane showed up. Otherwise, I might do something I'd regret later. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, I still didn't know. That night, I couldn't sleep. Brett kept texting me and each message got more desperate. He said everyone on the cruise was talking about the yacht. He said his mom was really embarrassed because people kept asking her about it. He said Amy and Jeremy were uncomfortable and the whole family dynamic was weird now. Then he sent the text that really got to me. "You've made your point. When are you coming home?" Like this whole trip was just me punishing him instead of me actually enjoying time with my own family. Like I'd planned this yacht trip just to make him feel bad, and not because his mother had excluded me from a family vacation. I put my phone on silent and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about what my mom had asked. What did I really want? The next afternoon, I was on the upper deck when I saw the water taxi approaching. Diane was sitting in the front wearing what looked like her nicest cruise outfit, a flowered dress and sandals with a sun hat. But as the taxi got closer and she could see the Mariana up close, I watched her face change. Her mouth opened a little and she grabbed the side of the taxi. The yacht was huge compared to the little boat she was in. When she stepped onto our dock, she had to look up and up to see the top decks. She looked so small standing there next to the yacht, almost like a kid seeing something overwhelming for the first time. I walked down to meet her and kept my voice polite but not warm. "Welcome aboard. Let me show you around." She followed me up the stairs to the main deck, and I could feel her hesitating with each step. My family was having lunch at the big table on the deck. Fresh fruit and pastries spread out everywhere. My mom stood up when she saw us and walked over with her hand extended. "You must be Diane. It's so nice to finally meet you." Her voice was perfectly gracious and polite, but somehow it felt more cutting than if she'd been rude. Like she was showing Diane exactly how you're supposed to treat family. Diane shook my mom's hand and tried to make conversation. She started talking about how nice the cruise ship was, and how many restaurants it had, how there were shows every night and a casino and multiple pools. She was comparing everything favorably to the yacht, like she was trying to convince herself the cruise was better. Then she looked past my mom and saw our chef preparing lunch. He was working on fresh lobster and the smell was amazing. There were bottles of wine chilling in ice buckets. The table settings were actual china and crystal glasses. Diane stopped talking mid-sentence. She just stood there looking at the setup, and I could see her face change as she realized everything she'd been saying was obviously wrong. The yacht was better in every way, and she knew it. She went completely quiet after that and just followed me as I showed her around. I took her to see the hot tub on the side deck, then the jet skis tied up at the back, then the helicopter on the upper landing pad. With each new thing I showed her, Diane got smaller and quieter. She stopped trying to justify the cruise or make comparisons. She just walked behind me silently and nodded when I pointed things out. I started to feel less satisfied with each stop. I'd wanted her to see what she'd excluded me from, but watching her get so obviously humiliated wasn't as good as I thought it would be. It just felt uncomfortable and kind of mean, like I was kicking someone who was already down. My dad must have noticed because he came over and started making polite conversation with Diane. He asked her about the cruise ship and how Brett's family was enjoying their trip. He asked about her other kids and what they did for work. His voice was genuinely courteous and interested. Not fake polite like he was mocking her, but actually kind, which somehow made Diane's treatment of me look even worse by comparison. She stumbled through her answers and kept glancing at me like she was trying to figure out who I really was. Like she'd thought she knew me for 4 years, but was realizing she'd been completely wrong. My dad kept the conversation going easily while Diane got more and more uncomfortable. Finally, Diane cleared her throat and asked if Brett could come visit too. I told her of course he could take a water taxi over whenever he wanted. She looked so relieved and immediately pulled out her phone to text him. I could tell she was hoping his presence would make this whole thing less awkward. Or maybe she thought he could convince me to stop whatever I was doing and just forgive everyone and come home. I watched her type quickly on her phone and hit send. Then she looked up at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Part embarrassment, part confusion, part something else I didn't recognize. Diane opened her mouth and I could see the words forming before she spoke them. "I didn't know your family was so wealthy. I mean, if I had known." I held up my hand and she stopped mid-sentence. I told her the money wasn't the point and never had been. The point was that she'd been excluding me from family events for 4 years, whether it was a cruise or a weekend at the lake house or a wine tasting tour. My family's money didn't change the fact that she'd made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. Diane's expression shifted from apologetic to defensive, and then back to something like shame. She looked past me at the yacht and then back at my face like she was trying to recalculate everything she thought she knew about me. She started to explain that she really did think I preferred spending time with my own family, that she was trying to be considerate of my needs. I cut her off and asked her directly why Jeremy's girlfriend of 3 months was more family than Brett's wife of 4 years. The question hung in the air between us, and I watched Diane's mouth open and close without any sound coming out. She looked down at her hands and started picking at her cuticle. The silence stretched out, and I didn't fill it. I just waited while she stared at her fingers, and couldn't come up with a single answer that would make sense. A water taxi appeared around the side of the yacht, and I saw Brett climbing out onto our dock. His shirt was wrinkled, and his hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. He walked across the deck and went straight to his mother first, not to me. He looked around at the yacht with wide eyes and told Diane how incredible it was, how massive, how luxurious. I felt heat spread through my chest watching him try to smooth things over with her, before he'd even acknowledged what she'd done to me. He was still doing it, still prioritizing her comfort over everything else. Diane grabbed his arm and started talking quietly to him, but I could see her gesturing at me and at the yacht. Brett nodded and put his hand on her shoulder like he was comforting her. My brother's girlfriend came up from the lower deck right then with a drink in her hand. She'd only been dating my brother for a month, but she walked right over to Diane and Brett with this warm smile and introduced herself. She shook both their hands and asked about their cruise, genuinely interested and friendly. My brother followed her up and casually mentioned how glad he was that she could join us on such short notice, how his family always made new people feel welcome right away. Diane actually flinched when he said it. Her whole body did this little recoil, and she looked at my brother's girlfriend and then at me, and I could see her making the comparison in real time. Brett finally turned to me and touched my elbow. He asked if we could talk privately, and his voice had this strained quality to it. I nodded and led him to one of the smaller lounges on the side deck. We weren't even sitting down yet when he started talking about how embarrassed his family was, how everyone on the cruise ship kept asking about the yacht, how the captain had made announcements about it. He paced back and forth in the small space, and I realized he still didn't understand why I was upset. He was focused entirely on his family's embarrassment, and not at all on the fact that his mother had excluded me, and he'd let it happen. I told him I didn't charter this yacht to embarrass his family. I chartered it because his mother excluded me from a family vacation, and he sat there and let it happen without saying a single word in my defense. Brett's hands moved in frustration, and he argued that I could have just talked to him about it instead of making this big statement. I reminded him that I did talk to him about it, and his solution was to suggest I book myself a separate room on a different floor. His face changed when I said that, and he went quiet for a second. Brett admitted that suggesting the separate room was wrong, but then he said this whole yacht thing was over the top and making everything worse. I asked him if he would have actually stood up to his mother if I'd just stayed home quietly and accepted being excluded. He looked away from me and stared out the window at the ocean. I waited for him to answer, but he couldn't do it honestly. He knew, and I knew, that he would have just let it slide like he always did. We stood there in silence for a moment, and then I walked back toward the main deck. Brett followed behind me without saying anything else. When we got back to the main area, I saw Diane talking to my mother near the railing. My mom's expression was polite but strained, the way she looked when someone was saying something she strongly disagreed with, but she was too well-mannered to argue. Diane was gesturing with her hands and talking quickly. My mom caught my eye over Diane's shoulder and gave me this subtle head shake. Just a tiny movement that let me know the conversation wasn't going well, and Diane was making excuses instead of taking real responsibility. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from Amy. She was asking if she and Porter could come visit the yacht too. I was surprised she was reaching out directly instead of going through Brett or asking Diane to ask for her. I texted back that yes, they were welcome to come over. She responded immediately saying they'd get a water taxi and be there soon. I put my phone away and told Brett his sister was coming. He looked relieved, like maybe Amy's presence would make this whole situation less tense. About 45 minutes later, another water taxi pulled up, and Amy climbed out with Porter behind her. She looked around the yacht with obvious curiosity, but not the defensive attitude Diane had. She walked over to me and asked if we could talk for a minute. I nodded, and we moved away from the group to a quieter spot near the bow. Amy took a breath and apologized for not speaking up when her mom announced the cruise without including me. She said she felt uncomfortable about it at the time, but didn't want to cause family drama by confronting her mother. She admitted that was wrong and she should have said something. I appreciated the honesty, even though it didn't fix what had happened, or change the 4 years of similar exclusions. At least Amy was acknowledging it instead of making excuses. Porter stepped closer and put his hand on Amy's shoulder. He looked at me directly and said what Diane did was messed up, and he told her so at the time. He explained that several family members felt uncomfortable with my exclusion, but nobody wanted to confront Diane because she gets defensive and makes everything worse. Amy nodded and added that her mom has a way of turning any criticism into an attack on her character. We walked back toward the main area where Diane was still talking to my mother, and Brett stood nearby looking anxious. The group dynamics shifted the moment Amy and Porter joined us. Diane was in the middle of explaining something to my mom when she noticed her daughter approaching. Amy sat down across from Diane and the conversation paused. My mom excused herself and went to check on something with the crew. Diane tried to continue her explanation about how cruise ships are actually more fun than private yachts, but her voice trailed off when nobody responded. Amy looked at her mother and said gently that this wasn't the first time she'd excluded me from family events. Diane's face flushed red and she started to argue, but Amy held up her hand. She listed the Vegas reunion, the lake house weekend, the wine tasting tour. Diane got more defensive with each example and insisted there were good reasons for all of them. Brett jumped in to defend his mother and said she just has trouble adjusting to new family members. Amy turned to look at her brother and pointed out that I'd been family for 4 years. She asked how long someone needs to be married before they count as real family. Brett opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The fact that his own sister was holding me accountable when he wouldn't hit me hard. I'd been making excuses for Brett's behavior for years, but watching Amy stand up for me when my own husband couldn't made me realize how deep our marriage problems actually went. This wasn't just about Diane. This was about Brett choosing his mother's comfort over his wife's dignity every single time. Another water taxi pulled up to the yacht, and Jeremy climbed out with Camila right behind him. Diane stood up when she saw them approaching. Jeremy looked uncomfortable as he walked onto the deck, and Camila smiled brightly and waved at everyone. There was this awkward moment where Diane realized her son had brought his girlfriend of 3 months to see the yacht she'd excluded her daughter-in-law from. Jeremy's face went red, and he mumbled something about Camila wanting to see the boat. Camila seemed completely oblivious to the tension, and started asking questions about the helicopter and whether we'd used the submarine yet. My dad appeared and suggested we all have lunch since everyone was here. He signaled to the chef, and within minutes the crew was setting up a full meal on the main deck. We ended up with this surreal situation where Brett's entire family sat on our yacht eating food prepared by our private chef. The lunch spread included fresh-caught fish, grilled vegetables, and some kind of fancy pasta dish I couldn't even pronounce. The conversation was strained and awkward. People made small talk about the weather and the islands we'd visited. Brett tried to act normal but kept glancing at me nervously. I could see my dad watching Brett carefully from across the table. He wasn't saying much, but I knew that look. He was evaluating my husband's character, and clearly finding it lacking. My mom asked polite questions about the cruise ship, and Diane answered in short sentences. Amy and Porter exchanged looks that said they wanted to be anywhere else. Jeremy focused on his food, and Camila kept trying to start conversations that died quickly. Diane made one more attempt to justify herself halfway through the meal. She said she was actually trying to give me a break from family obligations since I'm always so busy with work. My mother had been quiet through most of lunch, but she spoke up for the first time. She said very politely that excluding someone isn't giving them a break. She explained that exclusion tells someone they don't belong. The table went completely silent. Even Camila stopped talking. Diane stared at her plate and her face turned red again. Brett looked like he wanted to disappear. My dad nodded slightly in agreement with my mom. Nobody knew what to say after that, so we all just finished eating in uncomfortable silence. After lunch ended, Diane asked if she could speak to me privately. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what she'd say without Brett there to defend her or make excuses. We walked to the upper deck away from everyone else. The view was beautiful up there, with the ocean stretching out in every direction and the cruise ship visible in the distance. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Diane stood at the railing for a long moment without speaking. She seemed to be working up the courage to say something. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. She admitted that she'd always felt threatened by me because I'm educated and successful. She said she worried I'd look down on her family because they didn't have college degrees or professional careers. I was stunned because I'd never done anything to suggest that. I told her I fell in love with Brett despite our different backgrounds, not because of them. I explained that I'd never cared about any of that stuff. Diane nodded slowly and said she could see that now. She confessed that seeing the yacht made her realize how much I'd downplayed my family's wealth all these years. She said she felt foolish for treating me like I was somehow less than her family, when the reality was so different. I stopped her and pointed out that the yacht isn't the issue. The pattern of exclusion is the issue. I told her that money doesn't change the fact that she's hurt me repeatedly over 4 years. She tried to argue that she didn't mean to hurt me, but I cut her off. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is the same every time. I asked Diane directly if she would have treated me differently if she'd known about my family's money from the start. She hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. She finally admitted that yes, she probably would have treated me better. I told her that's exactly the problem with her values. She judged me and excluded me based on what she thought I was worth, instead of treating me like family, because that's what I actually am. We walked back down to the main deck where everyone was still gathered around the lunch table. Diane stood at the head of the table and cleared her throat until everyone looked at her. She announced that she owed me an apology, and her voice was steady instead of defensive like before. She said she'd excluded me from family events over the years, and it was wrong no matter what her reasons were or what my background was. She looked directly at me when she said it, and I could tell this time she actually meant it. Brett's whole body relaxed like someone had cut strings holding him up. He smiled at me from across the deck, and I knew he thought his mother's words fixed everything between us. But I understood we had way bigger problems than just his mother's behavior toward me. I thanked Diane for the apology and told her I appreciated her honesty. Then I made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent changed behavior over months and years. I said words were a good start, but actions mattered more. Diane nodded and didn't argue or make excuses, which was different from how she usually handled being called out. The visit wrapped up after that with Brett's family needing to get back to their cruise ship before dinner. Amy came over and hugged me tight before she left. She whispered in my ear that she was glad I stood up for myself and that someone needed to do it years ago. Porter shook my hand firmly and said he hoped this was a turning point for how the family treated me going forward. Jeremy gave me an awkward wave and Camila smiled but didn't say anything. Brett lingered on the dock looking back at the yacht like he wanted to stay. Diane thanked my parents for lunch with actual politeness, and my dad nodded at her with the same courtesy he'd show any guest. I watched their water taxi pull away toward the massive cruise ship in the distance. My mom came and stood beside me at the railing. She didn't say anything, but she squeezed my shoulder, and I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over me. That evening, my family and I had dinner together at the big table on the main deck. The chef made fresh-caught fish, and my siblings were talking about the next day's plans for jet skiing. My dad waited until everyone had finished eating before he asked me directly what I planned to do about my marriage. The table went quiet, and everyone looked at me. I set down my water glass and admitted I didn't know if Brett and I could recover from this. I said it revealed something basic about how he handles conflict and family loyalty. My brother jumped in and pointed out that Brett had multiple chances to defend me. He said Brett chose his mother's comfort over my dignity every single time it mattered. My mom added more gently that I deserved a partner who stood beside me. She said I didn't deserve someone who suggests I book my own room when his family excludes me. My dad listened to all of this and then asked what I wanted to do, not what I thought I should do. I told him honestly that I loved Brett, but I couldn't keep living like this. I said I needed to see real change over time before I could trust him again. I spent that night in my cabin thinking about my marriage instead of sleeping. The yacht rocked gently, and I could hear the ocean outside my window. I realized the whole yacht situation was just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Brett had never fully separated from his mother's influence in 4 years of marriage. I'd been accommodating that broken dynamic the entire time without even realizing it. Every time Diane excluded me and Brett made excuses, I'd told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I'd convinced myself that being the bigger person meant accepting less than I deserved. But watching my own family's unconditional support this week showed me what real family actually looked like. My parents had never once made me feel less than or excluded my partner from anything. They'd welcomed Brett from day one without conditions or tests. The contrast was so obvious now that I couldn't unsee it. The next day, Brett texted asking if he could come back to the yacht to talk just the two of us. I agreed after thinking about it for a while. He arrived on a water taxi around noon looking serious and tired. I could tell he'd been thinking hard about everything that happened over the past few days. We sat in one of the smaller lounges away from my family. Brett started by apologizing for not defending me, and for the first time he didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain his mother's behavior or justify what happened. He admitted he'd been conflict avoidant his whole life and it damaged our marriage. He said he wanted to change, but he didn't know how to do it. His hands were shaking slightly when he spoke, and I realized how scared he was of losing me. I told Brett that I needed him to understand something important. I said his mother's apology didn't fix what he did to me. Diane excluded me from the cruise, but he allowed it to happen. He even suggested I accommodate her exclusion by booking my own separate room. I said that betrayal came from my own husband, not from my mother-in-law. Brett's face crumpled and he put his head in his hands. He broke down and admitted he'd been scared of his mother's disapproval his whole life. He said he realized now that he'd been sacrificing our marriage to keep her happy. He told me that seeing my family's unconditional support this week showed him how messed up his own family dynamics were. He said he never understood what healthy family relationships looked like until he watched my parents interact with everyone on the yacht. He kept saying he was sorry over and over, but I knew sorry wasn't enough to fix years of choosing wrong. I asked Brett what he was willing to do differently going forward. He lifted his head and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He said he wanted to start marriage counseling and set real boundaries with his mother. He talked about finding a therapist and making sure Diane understood she couldn't treat me like this anymore. I listened, but I'd heard promises before when things got bad. I told him I needed to see consistent action over time, not just promises made in a crisis. He nodded and said he understood, but I could see the hope in his eyes, like he thought this conversation meant we were okay now. We weren't okay. We sat there for a while longer, and I told him we needed space to think. I said he should finish the cruise with his family, and I'd complete my yacht trip with mine. He looked disappointed and asked if we could at least talk every day. I said no. We both needed time to figure out what we actually wanted without the pressure of constant contact. He accepted it, but I could tell it hurt him. He asked when we'd talk again, and I said after we both got home. Brett stood up to leave and hesitated at the door. He turned back and asked if I was planning to divorce him. The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have a clear answer. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. I said I loved him, but I couldn't stay in a marriage where I was always second to his mother's feelings. I explained that whether we survived depended entirely on his willingness to do the hard work of actually changing, not just talking about change. Brett's face crumpled again, but he nodded. He left without trying to hug me or kiss me goodbye, and I watched the water taxi take him back to the cruise ship. After Brett left, I went back to my cabin and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. My mom knocked softly and came in without waiting for an answer. She sat on the edge of the bed and asked if I was all right. I told her I didn't know if my marriage was going to make it. She didn't try to give me advice or tell me what to do. She just squeezed my hand and said whatever I decided, she and Dad would support me. That night at dinner, my family didn't ask questions about Brett. My brother made jokes, and my dad told stories about past yacht trips, and everyone acted normal. It felt good to just exist without having to explain or defend myself. The rest of the yacht trip became more relaxed without Brett's family hovering. I actually enjoyed the Caribbean for the first time since we'd arrived. We went snorkeling and I saw sea turtles. We took the helicopter to a tiny island that only had one restaurant. My parents held hands while walking on the beach, and I remembered what a healthy marriage was supposed to look like. My brother's girlfriend sat next to me one afternoon while we were sunbathing on the deck. She said she admired how I handled the whole situation with Diane. She told me she couldn't imagine being excluded like that and still keeping my composure. I appreciated her saying it. It felt good to be around people who naturally included and valued me. The contrast with Brett's family was so obvious now. I realized how much I'd been accepting that I shouldn't have. I'd normalized being treated as less than because it happened gradually over 4 years. But my own family never made me feel that way. They never made Brett feel that way either. They'd welcomed him completely from the start. On the last day of the trip, my dad found me on the upper deck watching the sunrise. He sat down and we were quiet for a few minutes. Then he asked if I was okay financially if I decided to leave Brett. I told him I was fine, that I had my own career and savings. He nodded and said he just wanted me to make decisions based on what I wanted, not what I could afford. I hugged him and thanked him for always having my back. We returned home the day after Brett's cruise ended. I went straight to my parents' house instead of the home I shared with Brett. That evening, Brett texted asking if we could meet to talk. I thought about it for a while before responding. I agreed to dinner at a neutral restaurant, wanting to see him in person to figure out if his promises of change were real or just panic. We met 3 days later at a place halfway between our house and my parents' place. Brett was already there when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me and looked nervous. We ordered food, and then he pulled out his phone. He showed me confirmation emails for his first therapy appointment scheduled for the following week. He'd also found a marriage counselor who had availability and booked our first session. I was genuinely surprised that he'd actually followed through so quickly. Usually Brett talked about doing things and then never got around to them. Brett also told me about a conversation he had with his mother on the cruise. He said he sat Diane down and set a clear boundary that she needed to treat me with respect, or he'd limit contact with her. I asked how she reacted, and he admitted she didn't take it well. She cried and said he was choosing me over his family. He told her I was his family, and she needed to accept that. He said it was one of the hardest conversations he'd ever had, but he didn't back down even when she got upset. This was completely new behavior for Brett. In 4 years of marriage, I'd never seen him stand up to his mother like that. I asked what happened after, and he said Diane barely spoke to him for the rest of the cruise. Amy told him later that their mom spent a lot of time in her cabin. I could tell Brett felt guilty about it, but he also seemed proud that he'd actually done it. I told him I was willing to try counseling, but I needed him to understand something important. I said I needed to see sustained change over months, not just initial effort that faded away. I'd seen him make promises before and then slip back into old patterns when things got comfortable again. He agreed and said he understood why I couldn't just trust him right away. Then he asked if I was moving back home, and I said not yet. I told him I needed to stay at my parents' place for a while longer. He looked hurt, but he didn't push me or try to convince me. He said he respected my boundaries and would wait until I was ready. That response alone showed more respect for my needs than he'd demonstrated in years. We finished dinner and he walked me to my car. He asked if we could have dinner again next week after his first therapy session, and I said yes. Driving back to my parents' house, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't despair either. Maybe it was just possibility. Over the next few weeks, Brett sent me photos of his therapy appointment confirmations and brief updates after each session. He didn't share details, which I appreciated because it meant he was taking it seriously instead of performing for me. 3 weeks in, he texted that his therapist identified something called enmeshment with his mother, and he was working on recognizing when he prioritized her feelings over mine. I could see him actually thinking about his responses now instead of just reacting the way he always had. When his mom called during one of our dinners together, he let it go to voicemail instead of answering immediately like he used to. Small things, but consistent. Then Diane texted me directly asking if we could meet for coffee. I stared at the message for a full day before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I was curious what she'd say without Brett there to manage the conversation. I agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our places. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table and fidgeting with her napkin. She stood up when she saw me and looked genuinely nervous. We ordered coffee and sat down, and she didn't seem to know how to start. Finally, she said she'd been thinking a lot about what happened and wanted to do better. Her voice was shaky and she kept looking at her hands. I waited for her to continue. She admitted she'd always been insecure about not coming from money, and she projected that onto me by assuming I looked down on her family. She said the yacht situation forced her to see her own prejudices and insecurities clearly for the first time. She'd convinced herself I was the snobby one when really she was the one judging people based on money. I appreciated the honesty because it felt real, not rehearsed. But I told her rebuilding our relationship would take time and consistent respectful behavior, not just one good conversation. She nodded and said she understood and didn't push for immediate forgiveness or ask when things would go back to normal. That response showed more emotional growth than I'd seen from her in 4 years. We finished our coffee and she asked if we could try meeting again in a few weeks. I said maybe and left it at that. Brett and I started marriage counseling the following week. Our therapist was direct and didn't let either of us make excuses. She made Brett walk through specific examples of times he chose his mother's comfort over our marriage. He had to say out loud that he suggested I book my own room on a different floor of the cruise ship instead of standing up for me. Hearing him repeat his own words back seemed to hit him differently than when I'd said it. The therapist helped him see how his conflict avoidance with his mother enabled her bad behavior and damaged our marriage. She also called me out for downplaying my family's wealth to avoid conflict, which I hadn't expected. She said hiding parts of myself to make others comfortable was its own form of dishonesty. We both had work to do. Brett kept going to his individual therapy and actually did the homework his therapist assigned. He started noticing patterns in real time, and sometimes caught himself mid-sentence when he was about to prioritize his mom's feelings. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine effort. 3 months after the Caribbean trips, we were in a better place but still taking things slowly. Brett maintained his boundaries with Diane even when she tested them. She called crying one night about something minor, and he told her he'd talk to her the next day when she was calmer, then actually hung up. Old Brett would have stayed on the phone for hours trying to fix her feelings. I watched this happen from across the room and felt something shift. He was actually doing it. Not just promising, actually changing his behavior consistently over months. My trust started rebuilding in small pieces. Amy texted asking if I wanted to have lunch, and I agreed. We met at a restaurant near her work, and she apologized again for not speaking up sooner about her mother's treatment of me. She said watching me stand up for myself on the yacht inspired her to set her own boundaries with Diane. She'd told her mom she wouldn't be available for daily phone calls anymore and needed advance notice for family events instead of last-minute demands. She said their relationship was actually improving because Diane respected her more when she had boundaries. I told Amy I was glad she was standing up for herself, but it was hard not to feel bitter that it took me chartering a yacht for anyone in Brett's family to see the problem. She said she knew and she was sorry it took something so dramatic. We talked about other things after that, and it felt almost normal. Then Diane called me, not Brett, to invite me to a family dinner. She explicitly invited me first before even mentioning it to Brett. She asked if the following Saturday worked for me and said she wanted to make sure I could come before finalizing the date. It was a small thing, but it showed she was thinking about inclusion differently. I told her Saturday worked and she sounded relieved. The dinner itself was still somewhat awkward but better. Diane introduced me to extended family members I'd never met, cousins and aunts who apparently lived nearby but had never been at family events I attended. She made a point of talking about my accomplishments and our marriage positively. She told her sister that Brett and I just celebrated our 5th anniversary and that I had an amazing career. Brett squeezed my hand under the table and I could see he was genuinely proud of his mother's effort. She was trying. It wasn't perfect, and I still felt guarded, but I could see visible change. After dinner, Brett and I decided to take a weekend trip together, just the two of us. We drove up the coast and stayed at a small inn with an ocean view. We didn't talk about his family or the yacht or therapy. We just walked on the beach and had long dinners and remembered what it felt like to be us without all the drama. He was more attentive than he'd been in years. He asked about my work and actually listened to my answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He reached for my hand while we walked, and it didn't feel like he was trying to fix something. It just felt natural. One night we sat on the balcony watching the sunset, and he said he was grateful I didn't give up on us. I told him I almost did. He said he knew, and he didn't blame me. We sat there quietly for a while, and I remembered why I fell in love with him in the first place. Before his mother's behavior and his inability to stand up to her had created this wall between us. 6 months later, I started packing my things to move back into our house. Brett helped me carry boxes from my apartment, and we worked quietly together, and it felt different from before. He'd been showing up consistently, calling when he said he would, standing up to Diane when she tried to overstep. The first night back in our bedroom felt strange but also right, like we were building something new instead of returning to what broke. He'd defended our marriage to his mother 3 times in the past month alone, telling her clearly that my needs came first. We still had hard conversations sometimes, but he didn't shut down or make excuses anymore. 2 weeks after I moved back, Diane called me directly instead of going through Brett. She asked if I had any preferences for dates for a family weekend at the lake house, and I almost dropped my phone. She wanted my input before finalizing anything, checking my schedule first, asking what activities I'd enjoy. I suggested mid-June and mentioned I liked kayaking, and she wrote it all down and said she'd plan around what worked for me. When the weekend came, I felt genuinely welcomed instead of tolerated, and Diane introduced me to her lake house neighbors as her daughter-in-law with actual pride in her voice. She asked my opinion on dinner plans and included me in conversations naturally, and it mattered more than I expected. Brett noticed me relaxing throughout the weekend and squeezed my hand while we sat on the dock. My parents invited both families to dinner at our house a month later, and I was nervous about how everyone would interact. Diane arrived early and brought flowers, and she was respectful and warm with my mother, asking about her garden and actually listening to the answers. My dad and Brett's father talked about golf while Brett stood beside me looking relaxed instead of tense. He wasn't trying to manage everyone's feelings or smooth over awkward moments. He was just present and comfortable. Amy helped me set the table and whispered that she'd never seen her mother this at ease with my family. Watching both families laugh together over dessert showed me how far we'd actually come. For our 5th anniversary, Brett planned a small private trip to a bed and breakfast in wine country. We spent 3 days walking through vineyards and having long dinners, and on our last night he gave me a necklace with both our family's birthstones twisted together in the design. He told me he was grateful I didn't give up on us when it would have been easier to leave. I held the necklace and realized that standing up for myself on that yacht saved our marriage instead of ending it, and that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are exactly the same. And that's the wrap-up. I always try to make sure there's something real to take away from each story. If this one gave you even a small idea, that's a win.